What if some of the most damaging people in your life are not the cruel ones, the selfish ones, or even the dishonest ones, but the genuinely good people who refuse to see danger when it first appears? That sounds backwards. We are taught to believe that kindness protects us, that optimism makes life better, that seeing the good in people is a virtue. And most of the time, it is. But there is a question hidden beneath that belief, a question that becomes more uncomfortable the longer we avoid it. What happens when goodness becomes a blindfold? Few literary characters embody this paradox more quietly than Jane Bennet. Not because she is malicious. Not because she is foolish. In fact, quite the opposite. Jane represents something deeply admirable. She is patient, generous, emotionally steady, and remarkably willing to believe the best about other people. She functions almost like the emotional center of gravity around her family. Wherever tension appears, she softens it. Wherever suspicion emerges, she counters it with understanding. Wherever conflict threatens to grow, she instinctively searches for a more hopeful interpretation. At first glance, that sounds like wisdom. But what if it isn't? What if the ability to preserve harmony sometimes comes at the cost of recognizing reality? Imagine standing inside a beautiful old house. The walls are elegant. The rooms feel warm. Everything appears stable. Then one day, a small crack appears in a support beam. Nothing dramatic. Nothing catastrophic. Just a tiny fracture. Most people would want to inspect it immediately. But what if someone said, "It's probably nothing"? Then another person agreed. And another. Soon, the comfort of believing the house is safe becomes more attractive than the discomfort of asking difficult questions. The crack remains. The danger grows. And nobody feels alarmed because optimism has quietly replaced observation. That image, a family living comfortably beneath a ceiling that is slowly weakening, is one of the most powerful ways to understand Jane Bennet's role. Because Jane is not merely a character. She is a pattern. A pattern that appears in families, friendships, workplaces, institutions, and sometimes entire societies. The pattern is simple. Human beings do not always reject truth because they are deceived by others. Often, they reject truth because reality is emotionally expensive, and hope feels cheaper. That is where the mystery begins. Why do intelligent people ignore warning signs? Why do families overlook problems that later become crises? Why do communities continue believing things that evidence has already challenged? The answer may have less to do with ignorance than we think. Because the most dangerous illusions are rarely the ones forced upon us. They are the ones we willingly protect. Jane Bennet stands at the center of that uncomfortable idea. Not as a villain. Not as a victim. But as a symbol of a deeply human contradiction. The more we value emotional safety, the more tempted we become to filter reality through hope. And once hope becomes a filter, something strange happens. We stop asking whether something is true. We begin asking whether it is pleasant to believe. That shift seems small. Almost invisible. Like a warning letter left unopened on a table. Like a crack spreading silently across a mirror. Like a window that could reveal what is happening outside, but whose curtains remain closed. And the question that follows is far larger than Jane Bennet herself. If human beings naturally prefer comforting interpretations over uncomfortable truths, then how many problems in our own lives are not hidden from us at all? How many are already visible, and we simply do not want to see them? If Jane Bennet represents a human tendency rather than merely a personality, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Why are people so attracted to hopeful interpretations in the first place? Because optimism is not simply a belief. It is often a form of protection. Most discussions about judgment begin with intelligence. We assume people fail to recognize danger because they lack information, experience, or wisdom. But human psychology points towards something far more complicated. Sometimes the obstacle is not what we know. Sometimes the obstacle is what we do not want to feel. Consider the difference between knowledge and acceptance. A person can notice a warning sign and still refuse to act on it. A family can recognize a problem and still postpone confronting it. An organization can receive clear evidence and continue behaving as if nothing has changed. Why? Because facts have emotional consequences. And that is where Jane becomes so fascinating. Her role is not simply to believe good things about people. Her role is to reveal what happens when emotional generosity begins competing with emotional honesty. Those two qualities sound similar. They are not. Emotional generosity asks, "What is the most charitable interpretation?" Emotional honesty asks, "What is the most accurate interpretation?" Most of the time, these questions lead to the same answer. But not always. And when they diverge, a conflict emerges that many people never notice. Because choosing accuracy can feel like an act of betrayal, a troubling possibility begins to appear. Perhaps optimism is not always the opposite of fear. Sometimes optimism is created by fear itself. Fear of conflict. Fear of disappointment. Fear of damaging relationships. Fear of discovering that reality is less comforting than we hoped. This creates a remarkable contradiction. The person who appears calm and trusting on the outside may actually be engaged in a quiet struggle on the inside. Not a struggle against other people, but a struggle against uncertainty. And uncertainty is expensive. The human mind would often rather have a reassuring story than an unresolved question. That preference shapes far more than individual decisions. It shapes entire families. Think again about that warning letter sitting unopened on a table. The danger is not the letter itself. The danger is the invisible agreement surrounding it. Nobody says, "Let us ignore the truth." Instead, everyone finds a reason to wait. Tomorrow. Next week. After more information arrives. After emotions settle. After someone else takes responsibility. The result is almost always the same. Delay creates vulnerability. And vulnerability quietly accumulates interest. What begins as a small misunderstanding becomes a larger problem. What begins as a neglected concern becomes a pattern. What begins as a crack in a mirror slowly spreads until the reflection itself can no longer be trusted. This is why Jane's significance extends far beyond a single family or a single story. She represents a universal psychological mechanism. The tendency to confuse good intentions with reliable judgment. The tendency to believe that because our motives are pure, our conclusions must be accurate. But reality does not reward intentions. Reality responds to perception. A person can be compassionate and still misread a situation. A community can be moral and still overlook danger. A society can celebrate virtue while remaining blind to consequences. That scale shift changes everything. Because now the mystery is no longer about Jane. The mystery is about us. How often do human beings mistake emotional comfort for wisdom? How often do we call something hope when it is actually avoidance? And if optimism can sometimes function as a shield against uncomfortable truths, then what happens when an entire group of people begins hiding behind the same shield at the same time? That question leads us toward a much deeper contradiction, one that sits at the center of human nature itself. Because the greatest errors are rarely born from bad intentions. They often emerge from virtues that were never questioned. If virtues can produce consequences that resemble the consequences of flaws, then we arrive at a deeply unsettling question. How do we know when a strength has quietly become a weakness? Because the real danger is not obvious corruption. The real danger is a virtue that no one thinks should be questioned. This is where the contradiction surrounding Jane becomes much larger than personality. Most people assume that character flaws announce themselves. Pride looks like pride. Greed looks like greed. Manipulation often leaves visible traces. But some patterns are much harder to detect because they arrive wearing the mask of goodness. And optimism may be one of them. Not optimism itself, but optimism that is never challenged. Optimism that becomes automatic. Optimism that stops asking questions. At that point, something subtle begins to happen. A person's relationship with reality changes. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Slowly. Almost invisibly. The mind begins filtering evidence before it reaches conscious judgment. Signals become exceptions. Warnings become misunderstandings. Patterns become coincidences. The crack in the mirror is still there, but attention moves elsewhere. This creates a fascinating paradox. The individual often feels morally superior while becoming strategically vulnerable. Why? Because believing the best about others feels noble. Questioning motives feels uncomfortable. Doubt feels unpleasant. Suspicion feels unfair. Yet reality does not operate according to emotional preferences. Reality remains indifferent to whether we find a truth pleasant or unpleasant. And this is where Jane's symbolic role becomes much more significant. She represents a collision between two competing human needs: the need to preserve connection, and the need to perceive accurately. Most of the time those goals work together. Sometimes they do not. Sometimes seeing clearly threatens harmony. Sometimes speaking honestly threatens relationships. Sometimes acknowledging a problem forces people to abandon a comforting story they have spent years protecting. And that is where many individuals hesitate. Not because they lack intelligence. Because clarity demands a price. The unopened letter remains unopened for a reason. The closed window remains closed for a reason. The truth outside may require action. Responsibility. Conflict. Change. The deeper we look, the more another mystery begins to emerge. Perhaps the opposite of wisdom is not ignorance. Perhaps the opposite of wisdom is emotional dependency on a particular outcome. The moment we need reality to be a certain way, our ability to evaluate reality objectively begins to weaken. That pattern appears everywhere. Inside families. Inside corporations. Inside governments. Inside entire civilizations. History is filled with examples of groups that saw warning signs long before crisis arrived. The information existed. The evidence existed. The signals existed. What was missing was not knowledge. What was missing was willingness. Willingness to accept that a cherished belief might be wrong. This is the escalation hidden beneath Jane's character. What begins as an individual habit of interpretation can become a collective habit of denial. And collective denial is far more dangerous than individual error. One person's blind spot creates a mistake. A group's blind spot creates a system. Once a system begins rewarding comforting narratives over uncomfortable realities, something remarkable happens. People stop searching for truth. They begin protecting stories. The smiling face becomes more important than the warning. The appearance of stability becomes more important than actual stability. The house still looks beautiful. Meanwhile, the support beams continue weakening. And this leads us toward an even deeper contradiction. What if the greatest threat is not that human beings fail to recognize evil? What if the greater threat is that human beings consistently underestimate the power of self-deception? Because the more we examine Jane's symbolic role, the less this appears to be a story about optimism. And the more it begins to look like a story about something far older and far more universal. The strange human tendency to negotiate with reality itself. And once that possibility enters the conversation, an even larger mystery appears. If people are capable of unconsciously editing reality in order to preserve emotional comfort, then how much of what we call perception is actually perception, and how much of it is desire disguised as truth? If perception can be shaped by desire, then the next question is no longer about whether people see reality incorrectly. The deeper question is why the mind would choose distortion in the first place. And this is where one of the most important revelations begins to emerge. The tendency represented by Jane is not fundamentally about optimism. Optimism is only the visible surface. Beneath it lies something much older, the human need to preserve psychological coherence. Every person carries an internal picture of how the world should work. Good people should have good intentions. Relationships should be guided by trust. Harmony should be preserved whenever possible. These assumptions create emotional stability. They help transform a chaotic world into something understandable. But they also create a hidden vulnerability. The moment reality threatens that internal picture, the mind faces a choice. It can update the picture. Or it can reinterpret reality. And surprisingly often, reinterpretation feels safer. This reveals something profound about Jane's symbolic role. She is not merely a person who believes in goodness. She becomes a symbol of the tension between truth and meaning. Because facts alone do not determine how people experience reality. Meaning does. A warning sign becomes dangerous only when someone accepts what it means. An uncomfortable observation becomes disruptive only when someone allows it to challenge an existing belief. Until then, the observation remains trapped outside the walls of understanding, like a visitor standing before a locked gate. Consider another image. A beautiful garden surrounded by a white fence. Every flower appears healthy. Every pathway appears orderly. Yet beneath the surface, roots are beginning to decay. The visible world remains unchanged. The invisible world is already shifting. That image captures one of the most overlooked aspects of human behavior. Most consequences begin underground. Long before they become visible. Long before anyone reacts. Long before anyone realizes that the conditions for crisis have already been established. This is why Jane's influence extends beyond personal judgment. Her significance lies in what she reveals about systems. Families operate through shared stories. Communities operate through shared assumptions. Institutions operate through shared narratives. The moment those narratives become more important than reality itself, adaptation becomes difficult. Not because information is missing. Because information must now compete with identity. And identity is powerful. People can abandon facts more easily than they abandon stories about themselves. This creates another layer of the paradox. The desire to remain good can sometimes interfere with the ability to remain truthful. The desire to remain compassionate can sometimes interfere with the ability to recognize consequences. The desire to preserve peace can sometimes prevent necessary change. Notice how different this is from ordinary misunderstanding. We are no longer examining an error in judgment. We are examining a structure of thought. A structure that quietly rewards emotional consistency over uncomfortable discovery. The closed window is no longer just a symbol of avoidance. It becomes a symbol of a worldview protecting itself. The unread letter is no longer merely neglected information. It becomes evidence of a deeper struggle between certainty and transformation. And perhaps that is the revelation hiding beneath everything we have explored so far. The greatest obstacles to truth are not always deception, ignorance, or malice. Sometimes the greatest obstacle is the desire to remain the same person after the truth arrives. And if that is true, then an even larger mystery begins to take shape. What if the most important question is not whether reality is difficult to see? What if the real question is whether human beings are willing to become different when they finally see it? If people do not resist truth because they cannot see it, and if they do not resist truth merely because it threatens comfort, then what is the deepest force operating underneath all of this? What is the final pattern that connects the closed window, the unread letter, the crack spreading across the mirror, and the quiet refusal to confront what is already present? The answer may be far more profound than a simple mistake in judgment. The central revelation is this: the pattern represented by Jane is not ultimately about optimism. It is about innocence. Not innocence as purity, but innocence as a way of relating to reality. Innocence assumes that the world should make moral sense. It assumes that good intentions should lead to good outcomes. It assumes that kindness naturally protects against harm. It assumes that sincerity and truth move together. Yet one of the hardest lessons in human existence is that reality does not always honor those assumptions. This is what makes Jane such an enduring symbol. Her role is not to show us a flawed person. Her role is to reveal a flawed expectation. The expectation that goodness alone is sufficient protection against consequence. That expectation appears everywhere. Parents believe love alone will solve problems. Leaders believe noble goals guarantee wise decisions. Communities believe shared values guarantee stability. Entire cultures believe that because they mean well, they will see clearly. But meaning well and seeing clearly are not the same thing. And that distinction may be the deepest insight hidden beneath the surface. The human mind often treats moral virtue as a substitute for perception. We unconsciously assume that if our intentions are good, our conclusions must be trustworthy. Yet reality separates these two things completely. A compassionate person can misjudge. A generous person can overlook danger. A sincere person can misunderstand the forces shaping the world around them. This is the paradox most people miss. The opposite of deception is not goodness. The opposite of deception is awareness. Those are not identical qualities. One belongs to morality. The other belongs to perception. And when people confuse them, vulnerability emerges. Imagine a lighthouse standing on a rocky coastline. Its purpose is not to be beautiful. Its purpose is to reveal hazards hidden in darkness. Now imagine a lighthouse keeper who values peace so deeply that he avoids looking toward approaching storms. The keeper remains kind. The keeper remains honorable. The keeper remains well-intentioned. Yet the ships still face danger. Because reality responds to what is seen, not to what is intended. That image captures the deepest layer of Jane's symbolic legacy. She represents a form of innocence that many people secretly admire within themselves. The desire to believe that goodness and truth naturally travel together. But the story points toward a more difficult understanding. Wisdom begins when those two paths separate. Wisdom begins when a person realizes that compassion requires perception. That kindness requires discernment. That love requires clarity. Otherwise, virtue itself can become disconnected from reality. This revelation expands far beyond one character, one family, or one novel. It reaches into politics, institutions, relationships, and history. Some of the most significant failures in human affairs have not emerged from cruelty. They have emerged from people who were unable to imagine outcomes that contradicted their hopes. The crack in the mirror was visible. The warning letter arrived. The window could have been opened. Yet the deeper attachment was not to ignorance. It was to innocence. And perhaps that leads us to the consequence that follows every revelation of this kind. If awareness demands the loss of comforting illusions, if wisdom requires us to surrender certain stories about ourselves and the world, then what exactly is the price of seeing clearly, and why have so many individuals, families, and civilizations throughout history chosen not to pay it? The price of seeing clearly is often discussed. Far less attention is given to the price of refusing to see. And that is where the true legacy of this pattern begins to emerge. Because consequences are rarely dramatic at first. They do not usually arrive like a thunderstorm. More often, they accumulate like dust in an abandoned room. Quietly. Gradually. Almost invisibly. By the time people recognize them, they appear to have come from nowhere. But they never come from nowhere. They grow in the space between reality and acknowledgement. This is the lasting consequence hidden within the kind of innocence we have been exploring. The immediate cost is not catastrophe. The immediate cost is delayed adaptation. Every moment spent protecting an illusion is a moment not spent preparing for reality. Every warning left unopened creates a gap between what is happening and what people believe is happening. Over time, that gap becomes expensive. Not only emotionally, but psychologically. A person who repeatedly avoids uncomfortable truths slowly loses confidence in their own perception. A family that consistently favors comfort over clarity develops fragile foundations. An institution that rewards reassuring narratives eventually becomes unable to respond effectively when circumstances change. The consequences are different in scale, but the mechanism remains remarkably similar. This is why the image of the house matters so much. The collapsing ceiling was never the real symbol. The real symbol is the period before collapse, when the structure still appears secure. Human beings tend to focus on visible outcomes. Yet history is shaped by invisible delays. Delays in recognition. Delays in response. Delays in acceptance. The deepest consequences often emerge long before the visible event that receives the blame. This realization transforms the meaning of Jane's legacy. Her significance is not that she represents a mistake. Her significance is that she reveals a vulnerability built into human nature itself. The tendency to underestimate the cost of emotional comfort. Modern life offers endless examples of this pattern. People ignore signs of exhaustion until burnout arrives. Relationships avoid difficult conversations until distance becomes permanent. Organizations dismiss small problems until those problems become systemic. Entire societies postpone confronting challenges because immediate reassurance feels more attractive than temporary discomfort. The unopened letter appears in different forms, but it never disappears. The closed window appears in different places, but it remains closed for the same reason. Not because people are incapable of understanding. Because understanding often demands change. And change requires sacrifice. That may be the most important legacy of all. Wisdom is not merely the ability to acquire knowledge. Wisdom is the willingness to reorganize your life around knowledge once it arrives. Many people achieve the first. Far fewer achieve the second. This creates another paradox. The greatest danger is not falsehood. Falsehood can be challenged. Falsehood can be exposed. The greater danger is a comforting partial truth that allows people to feel virtuous while remaining unchanged. Such beliefs rarely appear threatening. That is precisely why they endure. The crack in the mirror grows larger. The garden roots continue to decay beneath healthy flowers. The lighthouse still stands beside the shore, yet fewer people are willing to look toward the horizon. These images remain powerful because they point towards something that extends far beyond one character or one story. They point toward a recurring pattern in the human condition. A pattern that has shaped private lives, institutions, cultures, and civilizations for centuries. And yet one mystery still remains unresolved. If the cost of clarity is discomfort, and the cost of illusion is consequence, why do human beings so often choose the consequence they cannot see over the discomfort they can? Perhaps the reason this pattern continues to resonate is that it was never really about a single person. Long after the details fade, long after the social world surrounding the story feels distant, something remains. A feeling. A recognition. The sense that we have encountered a truth about ourselves that is difficult to forget once it has been seen. Not because it condemns human nature, but because it reveals one of its most enduring tensions. We spend much of our lives trying to become better people. More compassionate. More patient. More forgiving. More understanding. Yet somewhere along that journey, another responsibility quietly emerges. The responsibility not only to care about reality, but to allow reality to change us. That may be the deepest meaning hidden beneath all the symbols we have explored. The closed window. The unread letter. The cracks spreading across the mirror. The house that appears stable while unseen pressures accumulate beneath its foundations. None of these images are ultimately about danger. They are about relationship. The relationship between who we are and what is true. Because every human being eventually encounters moments when reality asks for something uncomfortable. Not punishment. Not suffering. Simply adjustment. A revised belief. A surrendered illusion. A new understanding of ourselves, other people, or the world. And those moments often arrive quietly. They rarely announce themselves as turning points. They appear as doubts. Questions. Small inconsistencies. Tiny fractures in stories we once trusted completely. What happens next may determine far more than we realize. Not because every misunderstanding leads to disaster, but because every refusal to examine reality shapes the person we become. Over time, perception is not merely a way of seeing the world. It becomes a way of participating in it. This is why the legacy of this idea extends beyond literature. It reaches into friendship, leadership, family, culture, and personal growth. Every generation inherits comforting narratives. Every generation inherits fears about what might happen if those narratives are challenged. And every generation faces the same choice. Whether to preserve certainty or pursue understanding. Yet perhaps the most moving aspect of all is that the story does not ask us to abandon kindness. It asks something more difficult. It asks whether kindness can survive contact with truth. Whether compassion can coexist with clarity. Whether love can remain intact when illusion disappears. Those questions matter because maturity is not the replacement of hope with cynicism. It is the reconciliation of hope with reality. It is the ability to keep the window open even when the view is unsettling. To read the letter even when the message is uncomfortable. To look directly at the crack in the mirror without turning away. And perhaps that is why this pattern remains timeless. Not because it belongs to one era, one family, or one character, but because it belongs to the permanent human struggle between comfort and awareness. The struggle between the world we wish existed and the world that actually does. In the end, the most important question may not be whether we are capable of seeing clearly. Human beings have always possessed that capacity. The deeper question is whether we are willing to love the truth enough to let it transform us. Because there may come a moment in every life when the difference between wisdom and illusion is not what stands before our eyes, but what we choose to do after we finally see it.